Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. 4 shootings and a stabbing left 7 people dead yesterday in Chicago, the city that led the nation in murders last year. And President Obama, in an interview with the relaunched New Republic, said about the dangers of head injuries in football, that if he had a son, he would, quote, think long and hard before I let him play. Right now, I am joined by Phyllis Bennis, director of the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, Horace Campbell, professor of African politics, African American studies, and political science at Syracuse University, Irshad Manji, author of Allah, Liberty, and Love, The Courage to Reconcile Faith and Freedom, and director of the Moral Courage Project at NYU's Wagner Research Center for Leadership in Action, and Nii Akuetteh, an independent Africa policy analyst and researcher and former executive director of the Washington, D.C.-based group Africa Action. Great to have you all here. Outgoing Secretary of State Hillary Clinton appeared before the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee on Wednesday, less than a month after being hospitalized with a blood clot, to testify about the U.S. consulate attack in Benghazi. The September 11th attack last year killed U.S. Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other Americans. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida was one of the few Republicans who asked sensible questions about U.S. involvement in Libya and lapses in security at the consulate.
Were you ever asked to participate in any sort of internal or interagency meeting before this attack with regard to the deteriorating security situation in Libya?
With specific security requests, they didn't come to me. I had no knowledge of them.
For the most part, though, Republicans seem to obsess over the comments of U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, over double talk and alleged cover-up, and whether Rice purposely downplayed the terrorist attack connection and underscored ties to protests over an anti-Muslim film.
We were misled that there were supposedly protests and then something sprang out of that, an assault sprang out of that. And that was easily ascertained that was not the fact. And the American people could have known that within days, and they didn't know that.
With all due respect, the fact is we had 4 dead Americans. Was it because of a protest, or was it because of guys out for a walk one night who decided they'd go kill some Americans? What difference at this point does it make? It is our job to figure out what happened and do everything we can to prevent it from ever happening again, Senator.
Hillary Clinton was a strong advocate for the U.S. military intervention that helped remove Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, and it will probably be seen as one of the defining moments of her tenure as Secretary of State. The question now facing Clinton's successor, President Barack Obama, and the U.S. is whether our intervention in Libya has produced the unintended consequence of empowering jihadists throughout North Africa, and how to manage that instability without producing more unintended consequences in what is now a very heavily armed region of the world. Militants in Algeria took hundreds of hostages last week and seized control of a gas refinery, which led to the deaths of at least 80 people. While in Mali, a landlocked country that borders Algeria to the south, French forces have intervened to try to contain an insurgency of Islamist rebels. Clinton warned that the U.S., quote, cannot permit Mali to become a safe haven, but also noted that the problem for policymakers is a regional one.
The Arab revolutions have scrambled power dynamics and shattered security forces across the region. Instability in Mali has created an expanding safe haven for terrorists who look to extend their influence and plot further attacks of the kind we saw just last week in Algeria.
I also want to bring in Robin Wright, author of The Islamists Are Coming, Who They Really Are, and a joint fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson International Center. Robin, great to have you. Just jump in any time here. We'll just pretend you're sitting at the table. I guess the first place I want to start in this is, and there's an economist, very provocative economist, cover this week with a clutched gun saying, Afghanistan, right? That the idea being that North Africa is going to be the new Afghanistan. I want to start with the Libya moment, because it seems to me like that's kind of a counterfactual fork in the road. And from the perspective of policymakers, the question is, how much of this is the result of the NATO intervention? And as someone who's studied this region, and I have to say, I was reading your congressional testimony about North Africa yesterday. It's been incredibly prophetic. You've gone before Congress a few times. How much do you see the intervention in Libya as a kind of moment that pushed us towards these cascade of effects we now see?
Oh, I think it did push us entirely. The question for me, though, is, was it intended? Mm-hmm. Was it ignored? Because I think where I differ with some people, we have to remember what happened before the NATO intervention. We have to remember that the Arab League requested intervention. We have to remember that Colonel Gaddafi was threatening to hand down all the people in the streets. We also have to remember that at that time, the revolution had started in Tunisia, and it had jumped to Egypt. And so it seemed to me that if you have a choice between not allowing people to be mowed down in the streets, you do that. Now, the link I see with other places is once you intervene, probably the intervention is always easy. It is the aftermath.
That's what we've learned.
And I think the question that I haven't had a satisfactory answer to is, how is it that with all the worries over the weapons from Colonel Gaddafi's arsenal flowing out, no one saw all these fighters, at least officially. We didn't see the fighters, we didn't know who they were, and they went all the way into Mali, when Mali shares no border with Libya.
So let's walk through the causal connection here, right? I mean, there's a few things here. There's a lot of arms that flowed out in the aftermath, right? So that those arms have sort of gone out into North Africa. That's part of the problem. Yes. There's a cadre of fighters that Colonel Gaddafi, from the ethnic group of Tuaregs, right, that he had hired as mercenaries, essentially. And when Gaddafi was being routed, they fled out and then back into their kind of ancestral homeland, which is in the north of Mali, right? So those are the two kind of causal links.
Yes.
I want to ask you, Robin, does the State Department, does Hillary Clinton and the Obama administration view the Libya intervention as a success? And how much do they view that intervention as what has precipitated the set of effects afterwards?
Militarily, the intervention by NATO in Libya was clearly judged widely as a success. It forced Gaddafi out of power, and it changed a state that had been among the most draconian in its practices at all levels into something that opened up hope for 6.5 million people. The problem is the United States has never been very good, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq, in creating an alternative. And the bottom line is the United States basically walked away, along with many of its allies, when it came to how do you create a new state? How do you facilitate the diverse forces, whether it's the tribal elements, the more than 300 militias that had formed during that brief 8-month involvement. How do you stem the flow of weaponry? How do you create an alternative? It's a little bit like if you saw Charlie Wilson's War at the very end of the movie, when Charlie Wilson, the former congressman, turns and says, I raised all this money, billions of dollars, for arms to the opposition, to the Mujahideen, to fight off the Soviets, but I couldn't raise a couple of $1 million for education. It's the same kind of problem. We're not good at figuring out what alternatives are. And as a result, Libya destabilized, and a lot of the arms that went into Libya, a lot of the forces that were militarized, flowed not just into Mali and Algeria, but across a huge chunk of Northwest Africa. And as a result, you see a huge destabilization that's affect, in turn, little Tunisia, which is in between Algeria and Libya. It has affected Egypt. And that there is this whole section of Africa now that is very vulnerable to jihadist extremists.
Phyllis.
You know, I think that what's important here is that while it may have been unintended that this would empower a wide range of militarized forces. It's not only, quote, jihadists, but it's a lot of people with a lot of guns. Right. But it was not unanticipated. It was talked about widely. It was anticipated that it would happen more inside Libya rather than over Libya's borders through Algeria into Mali. But it certainly was anticipated that this was exactly what was going to go on. By the time of the intervention, we should not forget, inside Libya, Libya was an ally of the United States. Yes. Now, it wasn't a great ally. We didn't maybe, quote, like it, but it was an ally. He was on our side. Gaddafi had given up his nuclear weapons, had given up everything that had made him a supposedly resistance hero in parts of the world. And he was now allied with the U.S., with Italy, with the UK, with France, with Europe. So this notion that we somehow had to intervene, you know, there were threats. There's no doubt about it. There were threats from Gaddafi against his population. Yes. But the idea that there was going to be an attack that was both inevitable and imminent in Benghazi simply was not the case.
Well, I think it's contested intensely.
It's contested,
now. Right?
exactly.
But I don't think simply not the case.
Right.
I mean, and I think one of the reasons I think it's important to kind of, I mean, it may seem weird. Why are we relitigating the Libyan intervention? But
because of the impact.
Well, but because of the impact, A, and B, because the first time around it never got litigated, right? I mean, what happened was and what's weird about the whole Benghazi issue to me is that this is kind of weird, kind of it's a way of talking about the Libyan intervention now after the fact, because we have these deaths and we have this tragedy and we have this cascade of effects, because we never talked about it the first time.
But we're not talking about it now either, Chris.
Right, we're talking about it in this very remote and oblique way.
We're only talking about the terrible
consulate, right?
The consulate issue. And Chris Stevens, we're not talking about what was the policy in Libya that led to that.
Irshad.
I don't want to take anybody away too long from Libya and North Africa.
Right.
I mean, that's the focus of this morning's panel. But I think all of what has been said this morning so far really helps explain, at least in part, why the U.S. government is so reticent to help Syrians.
Yes, right.
Because, as was pointed out during Kerry's confirmation hearing for Secretary of State this past week, when John McCain said, "Are we or are we not the friends of the Syrian people?"
Right.
It was Senator Kerry who pointed out that this is a country, not unlike many in the region, that has so many dimensions to it, not the least of which is what happens, once the various sectarian factions, Sunni, Shia, Druze, etc., how do they play out?
Yeah.
What happens with the Kurds? Where are the arms going?
And
where's the money
right,
going?
And
in a way, sorry, just to finish up the point, in a way, this is the kind of obliqueness that I think Phyllis is talking about, is that nobody's going to say, look at what has happened with Libya. They're not going to say that, obviously, but this is part of the lesson learning mission that, soon to be, I think, Secretary Kerry is on and needs to be on in order to figure out.
And I think that's,
how do we not be part of the problem anymore?
That's absolutely right. I think in terms of the counterfactual, right, it's Libya, we did intervene. In Syria, we are intervening in the sense that we're sending money and sort of helping other people send weapons. So it's not like we're just sort of sitting by. But in terms of what happened in Libya, I think that has been the lesson learned to the extent we can. Horace, my sense is that your feelings about the Libyan intervention are different than Nee's, and I want to get your sense about what the effects are right after we take a quick break.
Let me underscore the importance of the United States continuing to lead in the Middle East, in North Africa, and around the world. We've come a long way in the past 4 years, and we cannot afford to retreat now. When America is absent, especially from unstable environments, there are consequences. Extremism takes root, our interests suffer, our security at home is threatened.
I thought that was that's Hillary Clinton testifying this week, and I thought that line was so important because it kind of distills down, I think, the operational theory, right, in intervention here, or American leadership, which is when America is absent, especially from unstable environments, there are consequences. Extremism takes root, our interests suffer, security home is threatened. And Horace, that seems to me like a proposition that you don't agree with, and the Libya was a kind of failed implementation of that view.
First of all, Hillary Clinton has a very short memory. So the kind of leadership she's talking about, we have to be very clear what kind of leadership we want in Africa. The people in Africa want peace. They want unity and they want reconstruction. They do not want wars. And what happened in Libya is a sign of the kind of militarism that we've seen all over Africa from the U.S. Africa Command. 50,000 Libyans have been killed out of this intervention. The whole region of North Africa has been destabilized. There are 1,700 militias running around Libya today. The U.S. ambassador has been killed. The United Nations is calling for a full review. What the United States need is to have a review of its whole Africa Command and to withdraw its military forces. There's no need for the United States to be engaged with Africa through the military. Africa needs dentists, students,
right.
They need engineers, they need teachers, they need doctors, not the military. So what the leadership that Hillary Clinton is talking about is not what Africa needs. What we've seen from the Pan-Sahel initiative, the Trans-Sahara initiative, and the U.S. training of these militarists are the very same people who are creating the problems in North Africa today.
Let me just, I think people may not know this. Up until 2007, there was no distinct Central Africa Command in terms of the way that the Pentagon cleaved the world, right? There's CENTCOM and there's European Command. Beginning in 2007, there was initiation of AFRICOM, which is Africa Command. It currently is stationed in Europe, not actually in Africa, but there have been a variety of initiatives through AFRICOM AFRICOM, right, to train the soldiers of different African regimes, right, counterterrorism training, other kinds of training, and in fact, the soldiers of Mali. Mali was one of the kind of star pupils, right, in the AFRICOM.
That's what happens to stars.
Right,
and they're the same people now who are fighting.
Right. So I want to turn to Mali in a second, but first I just want to push back on this. Not push back, but to play devil's advocate about this intervention question on Libya, right? Which is that when you look at all the negative consequences of Libya, what do you say to Irshad's point about Syria, right? Because Syria, everything that you could say about Libya, Islamicization, weapons, destabilization, refugees, everything that's terrible about what has been the fallout of Libya seems to me happening in Syria as well, where there hasn't been the same kind of intervention. And so maybe it's just the nature of the conflict as opposed to what the U.S. or the West does or doesn't do.
No, that's a cop-out. Not the nature of the conflict. The very same jihadists who were called terrorists in the 2000, like the Libya Islamic Fighting Group,
right,
who were called terrorists. They were the same people who were financed to overthrow the Gaddafi regime. So all of these organizations that are now in Benghazi creating problems are the ones who are being financed by the CIA to go to Syria. So the United States cannot create terrorists and then go and fight them and to tell people that they're creating stability in the world.
Phyllis.
But of course that's exactly what the U.S. does. This is what the U.S. did in Afghanistan. This is what we're seeing there, where the U.S. supported and armed a whole group of Islamist fighters throughout the 1980s to fight the Soviet Union. And then suddenly now we're back fighting them directly. But I think if we look at Syria, it's very important to take what Irshad said to the next point, which is I think that this means there should not be military intervention beyond, I mean, there is military intervention. Let's not kid ourselves. The CIA is orchestrating who gets the weapons. The U.S. military is helping to facilitate all that. So we are intervening in Syria. That's a huge problem.
There's not military intervention explicitly from our forces.
Explicitly, yeah, but it's getting closer to that. But I think the problem here is we're looking at a scenario where we're denying that the actual opposition in Syria began and still has a crucial component, which is calling for nonviolent political revolutionary processes. They can call voices. No. But Chris, their voices are being drowned out by this massive militarization that has gone on.
But again, the question is the massive militarization, is that the product of...
It's both.
Right, exactly.
It's both.
I'm just saying it's not necessarily...
Part and there's an external part, and they come together in the form of weapons. And that's what has drowned out these voices that are still there. It's incredible bravery on the part of these people that are still coming out into the cities of Syria in the midst of the bombing, in the midst of these attacks, to say, we want a different kind of government here, but we don't want foreign intervention.
But what we have seen is that in the cauldron of war and in the cauldron of violence, right, it is often the case that liberal, secular, nonviolent, even radical, secular, nonviolent voices are diminished while the people with guns rise up.
And that's what the U.S. facilitates by sending all these weapons. That's what happens. That the people who have the weapons suddenly have the voice, and the people who issue those weapons.
But I am just saying that same process has played out in a million different environments in which the U.S. had nothing to do with it.
Not in a million without the U.S.
In the history of the world?
Well,
I mean, I'm just saying this is a dynamic of armed conflict.
No, but in the most recent history, that has been the role of the United States of America.
Robin, let me ask you very quickly. Do you because I want to turn to Mali because that's the place where the heat now is on because we have an explicit Western intervention in 2,300 French troops.
Yes.
Do you think the State Department what is their perspective on the French intervention in Mali and what Hollande is doing there? Is this worrying them? Is this worrying the Obama administration? Is there support for this?
Well, obviously, the United States is providing refueling facilities for the French warplanes. So, yes, the United States is playing a role already. I think there are no comfortable choices, and that's one of the realities across the region today, whether it's in Mali or Syria, and post-revolution Egypt and Libya. The United States doesn't have a grand strategy. It's looking at each case individually. The reality is that with Islamists taking over northern Mali, which is larger than France, just that part of it, this then creates a greater threat throughout the region. And unfortunately, the outside world dithered for way too long in trying to figure out a response. And to the earlier point, the fact is the Africans can't do it themselves. There's been talk for 2 decades about creating an African rapid deployment force, and they haven't been able to bring it together, provide training, cohesion, command and control, and as a result, there is no local or regional alternative.
Africans are opposed to opportunism. It's opportunism on the part of the France to go into Mali when there was a plan by the African Union and the United Nations Security Council. United Nations Security Council Resolution 2085 did not mandate France to go in. And with the history of France in Africa, Africans on the whole are opposed to French intervention.
Let me pause that for a second, because Robin just mentioned that the world dithered. And again, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, you were testifying before Congress saying the situation in Mali is very bad, it's very unstable, the U.S. is playing a destabilizing role. And I want you to just set up the parameters of what we're discussing when we're discussing about Mali, because I think it's confusing to a lot of folks right after we take this break.
Certainly.
All right, Nii, you testified a number of times before Congress about the situation in Mali before Mali was in the headlines.
Yes.
What is the backstory to the French intervention? What is the lay of the land in Mali that has brought us to this point?
Yes. It's popularly said, and I agree, that Mali has 4 crises. It's descended into 4 crises back in January of 2012. You have the Libyan intervention that brought in the arms, and therefore the civil war restarted. So
there had been a civil war, it had kind of abated, and it restarted in the wake of Libya.
The 4th round, because the first round was in 1962, 2 years after Mali became independent. So you've got this secession war restarting. Then 3 months after that, you've got the coup. In a U.S.-trained soldier in Bamako overthrowing the government that had 2 months to go and was about to hold elections. So that's the second crisis, the democracy crisis.
There's a democratically elected leader. He's 2 years from ending his term. There's
2 months.
2 months, sorry, 2 months from ending his term. There's a civil war that has restarted. The military is sort of angry at the leadership because they feel they're not getting support in the civil war. They show up at the presidential palace.
But that military was trained by the United States.
The
captain who overthrew the government was trained by the United States.
Through this AFRICOM.
6 times he came to the United States, and then he went back and had a coup d'etat.
That's right. And that wasn't the first time that U.S.-trained soldier. I mean, Gambia has been boiling. Nobody notices. The president there was trained by the U.S. 1 month after he got back into Gambia, he made a coup.
And after this coup, this U.S.-trained soldier who pulled it off in Mali, the U.S., unlike a lot of other international bodies, did not immediately condemn the coup.
Precisely. I think that is something that is missed, and I think it's very important, because when the coup happened, everybody, the United Nations, the African Union, even the World Bank and the IMF were condemning the coup. The State Department spokesperson, after they had an interagency meeting, said, we are not sure we can call it a coup. The soldiers had grievances. They need to talk to them. And now they have changed their tune. But I think it's very important to ask why they didn't condemn it as a coup. So we go to the third problem, of course, which now gets State Department attention very much, which is the terrorist problem. The fact that you've got 3 jihadist groups in the north, AQIM,
Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the Movement for Oneness and Jihad, which I said was one of the most chilling names I've ever heard in West Africa.
Yes, and
Assadin.
Okay, these are jihadist groups who have taken over control. Now, they were allied with the Tuaregs. But once the Tuaregs won and they declared independence of Azawad, what they call northern Mali, their allies shoved them aside and said, forget about your independence. We are here to implement Sharia law. And the fourth crisis of Mali is, of course, humanitarian, because it is the Sahara Desert. There are food problems every year, so people are already moving out looking for food, little water. So you've got those 4. But I think the 5th thing that should be added, and I don't see it added enough, is contagion. If this was happening in an island nation, we still, where it can't get out, we will weep over it, but not as much. But this has a great potential of destabilizing all of West Africa.
And much of Europe.
Yes,
much of Europe
absolutely.
As a result of the proximity between the two.
And let me just, I want to hone in on this one crucial dynamic, which is that there is essentially a civil war that was largely a civil war about these ethnic division, in which an ethnic group, a distinct ethnic identity, Tuaregs, were fighting for essentially self-determination. They partnered with largely foreign fighters who are explicit jihadis, right? Who once they got in the partnership, the jihadis threw them overboard and have now taken over.
Except one of the 3 major jihadi organizations, if we're going to use that term, and I think it is a troubling term in some ways, is a Tuareg-based Islamist organizations. So there is intersection.
Oh,
it's
absolutely.
It's not like there's these bad jihadis coming in from outside and good Tuaregs over here. Yes. There's a lot of intersection.
Wait, hold that thought. I want to get your response to this and talk about what to do next. I mean, how to move forward now. Is there an out for France? Is there an out for everyone in this?
Out is the key word.
Out, right. Yes, no, I think everyone wants an out after the break.
Out for France.
Well, not so fast.
So we have a current situation now in which the French have intervened. In fact, there's news reports this morning that they have taken a major strategic city that was held by, I'm not sure the right term, the Islamicists, let's say that.
Yes.
So the question now is, now what? I mean, this seems like the classic kind of quicksand intervention.
I think the U.S. is, in my mind, preferable to the French. Horace and I will agree that the French has a horrible record in Africa.
Because they were the colonial rulers of this area.
Sure, there were other colonialists. The French were particularly bad. Maybe the Portuguese would have rivaled them, but they had a bigger area. So I'm uncomfortable with them. But if the terrorists, jihadists, whatever we want to call them, are going to take Bamako, I'm glad that somebody stopped them, because it gives me nightmares of what would have happened if they had got into Bamako. I think that U.S. influence, because the U.S., I mean, look at us. The U.S. has civil society traditions that will hold the government's feet to the fire, whatever they are doing in Mali. I know
you sound like John Bolton, dude.
No. I have never seen him talk about civil society. Just one more point. I'm only saying comparatively, I don't see that in France, okay? If you look at French policy, colonial and neo-colonial policy, whichever side of the aisle, everybody just says, oh, it's Africa, let our government do whatever it wants. But you have the anti-apartheid movement here. You have
hold on one second.
Here that opposes what the U.S. is doing in Africa. So I would prefer the U.S. to France.
Robin,
the Africans.
Robin, you wanted to jump in. Robin,
I do. Whether it's the United States or France, the reality is that military force is not going to solve the problem alone.
Right. Yeah.
Bombing attacks are not going to remove the jihadists or not address the core issues that have divided Mali. And this is where you need a really much longer term solution. And this is where the United States has talked about smart power that's not just defense and diplomacy, but also includes economic development. And that's really the key in trying to deal with the intense poverty and sense of need and desperation in this large and strategically located African nation. I was in Bamako in the 1990s during the first visit by a Secretary of State. And the great question was, Mali as a model for Africa, could you have democracy endure in a country which doesn't have much of a middle class, where poverty is so rampant and doesn't have a whole lot of outside aid to help it develop? And so the great question is not just how many resources are devoted right now to get rid of the jihadist extremists, marginalize, recapture the north, put in, allow for democratic elections to put back a representative government. But what do you do? What does the outside world do to try to create a viable state and stabilize, create a model all over again in this region now of deep instability?
The outside world can't ever do that, in my view. I don't think it's ever succeeded. That has to come from inside. The kinds of intervention that we're seeing is solely aimed at the military part, and what we're already seeing is that French planes have killed civilians in various cities.
What's so interesting, though,
all of the discussion have ignored the people of Mali. All of the discussion about what to do ignore the fact that there's a civil society in Mali, that there are Malian people who want peace, and the Malian people do not want the military.
As Robin pointed out, the world has ignored already what Africans wanted. Africans went to the United Nations Security Council for months asking for a mandate to intervene. We all dithered. Now, frankly, given the destruction and the sheer inhumanity, barbarity, really, of of Sharia law that has taken hold in northern Mali. It is time for military intervention. I strongly support the French, but I am very glad that the United States did not take the role that the French have, because, of course, the world would be up in arms about that. I think that now is the time for the United States to seriously think through what kind of humanitarian assistance can it give Mali. Since the French are doing the dirty work, it's time for the United States to get smart about soft power.
Horace, I want you to have the last point here.
I think anyone who talks about France intervening in Africa to help Africans do not have a sense of the history of the destruction and killing and the torture that has been carried on by French. This was an opportunist move by France.
We're talking about now.
Move by France to preempt work that was being done by Africans who wanted to go in. What we've seen in Somalia, that after all the talk about Somalia, it was the African troops who cleaned up the Somali situation. In the final analysis, it will be Africans on the ground who will solve the problem.
Horace Campbell, Professor of African Politics, African American Studies, and Political Science at Syracuse University, and Africa Policy Analyst Nii Akuetteh. Thank you for joining us this morning. That was fascinating, and there were so many different perspectives there that I had not been anticipating. Rooting for an American intervention over the French. All right.